Well, welcome everyone. I am Dr. Tunisha Singleton, a part of faculty in the media psychology program here at Fielding Graduate University. I am super excited and delighted to be here and invite you actually to listen into a very special capstone presentation. I am always super humbled and super blessed anytime a student asks me to be their advisor and help guide them think through things that they've been passionate about, but also something that they want to help extend and something that they want to make better and just strengthen and help create solutions and help just try to critically think about some of these things that are so important to us and that are intersected all about the human experience, which is really the crux of media psychology. So Leslie, I was so honored and it's super excited when you asked me. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and introduce her to you, and then I will kick this over because nobody came here to listen to me. You came to listen to all of the brilliant material that Leslie has prepared for you. Now, Leslie Poston, she came into our program in spring of 2020. And I remember at the time I was running a lot of the NSOs, our new student orientations, so people could get familiar a little bit with our learning model and how our structure and our courses work and all of that stuff. And I just remember instantly being very surprised at how much energy Leslie has and all of the things that she's interested in. She is interested in mind, media, technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of these different topics that when I rattle them off can sound like they're so very in their own lanes, which in some degree they are, but the root of all of these things that are so that you can connect all of these dots is the psychology factor, the human element, the human experience element, and what draws people into these things. What are the relationships that we have with these things and why? And Leslie in particular is very interested in dismantling corrupt systems of oppression, climate injustice, racial injustice, inequities, all of these different things, which is so very large. And her passions and her roots in looking into civic engagement and creating solutions for social change and helping strengthen these types of things is completely in our backbone of media psychology. And I applaud everyone, including Leslie, for really doing the deep dive into looking at how can we start to control what we can control, create new systems for better sustainability, for community well-being, and to right some of the wrongs that have been just so generational. And how can we do that in a very progressive, sustainable way? And so I'm very honored again to be, that Leslie asked me to help her with this and to be her advisor for this capstone, which enough about me. I'm going to tell you now just a little bit about the presentation that Leslie is going to be giving you. It's titled More Than Symbolic, Exploring Fandom to Close Gaps in Restorative Movements. So with that, I will kick it over to Leslie. And what we'll do, just so you know about the structure, Leslie is going to give her presentation for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. So you're all familiar with Zoom. Use the chat if there's anything that you would like to comment on, and just so you don't forget if you have a question, so that we could bring it up. Because once she's done, we will have about 10-15 minutes set aside to have a nice Q&A and just open conversation about this stuff. Okay, great. Leslie, I will kick it over to you.
Absolutely. So before I share my screen, if you don't know who I am, prior to all of that amazing introduction, I'm also a marketer by day. I'm a chief marketing officer at an AI company. And one of the reasons I wanted to work on this topic, there's so many reasons, but one of the main reasons is as a marketer at the top of my career, looking back on my career, I can see every point at which marketing has contributed to this problem. So I feel like a media psychology degree is giving me extra insight on how marketing can be flipped and used to solve the problem. And I use psychology at work every day in AI. So this whole trajectory with my education has been just an added bonus to my everyday life. So that's what I do every day, and one reason why I wanted to work on this problem. And I'm going to share my screen and then turn my camera off just to make sure the bandwidth is good and you can see what I'm sharing. I'll turn my camera back on at the end. should be seeing just a desktop right now. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. You should be seeing a cover slide now. Is that correct?
Yep, you got it.
Beautiful. All right. So picking this topic was it's a big chunky topic, as those of you who are also working on it know, and narrowing it down to the Women's March, which is what I decided to focus on as an example of building fandoms, was a bit difficult. And I will explain that in slide 3 or 4 how I got there. But I felt like that was the most effective way to show what I meant when I say we can use fandoms to close these gaps in restorative justice movement. This quote is from a science fiction author, or I should say authors. It's actually 2 people who write under one pen name. You may be familiar with their work under the television show The Expanse. Progressive activism, especially when seeking restorative justice, can feel like it's just one drop in a giant bucket compared to the size of the problems we're trying to solve. And this can create huge feelings of futility. And these feelings of futility contribute to the difficulty creating fandoms around progressive causes. But sustained effort accumulates. This is what a full bucket of activism after months of collective drops of effort can look like. This is just in the United States. 1.6% of the United States population participated in the 2017 Women's March. That's a massive amount, but it didn't stop there. This is what it looks like when an overflowing cohort of people are looking to help you carry your bucket of activism and fill their own buckets. The movement spreads to 261 countries. My source for these statistics was the Washington Post, which will be linked at the end. They did a big expose quantifying the women's movements that I found very interesting. And we'll talk about later how it was more white dominated than it should have been, considering the subject matter. As we know, several gaps exist in restorative justice movements that can compress their overall civic benefits. Gaps exist where there are challenges in cohesiveness, challenges with symbolism, challenges building follower support, challenges with consistent messaging. And we can look to fill some of those gaps with fandoms and create what is called active publics out of these fandoms. Why study this now? There is a real and present humanitarian crisis in many parts of the world. We're all aware of this. It's driven in part by the massive traction that regressive movements have been able to obtain by creating fandoms in their own supporters, right? So regressive supporters tend to support fan movement building a little more readily than progressive supporters, which we'll go into. This growing crisis is exacerbated by the struggle that progressive organizations have creating the publics necessary to build similar sustained momentum. This is especially pressing in the United States. We additionally have a culture of individualism here that contributes to these challenges with unified message building. And I think that restorative justice organizations can strengthen and improve their chances for short-term success, effectiveness, and long-term sustainability by utilizing fan theory and social identity theory. How did I pick the Women's March? Basically, there are 2 effective examples of regressive movements with enthusiastic fandoms that continue to sustain themselves long past the motivating events, one of which, as you know, are the MAGA people, Make America Great Again, supporters of Trump, the increasing fandom surrounding the anti-vaccination movement during a global pandemic, and then 2 examples of progressive movements that were candidates. One was the sustaining fandoms of Obama supporters that he had during his 2 presidential runs, and the Women's March. Obama's supporters coalesced around the ideas of hope and change, but never became a truly cohesive group long-term, which I thought made them a poor candidate for analysis. However, the Women's March is an excellent example of a movement that could conceivably build a long-lasting fandom around its cause with the right changes and shifts in organization and messaging. Liberals have a tendency, and progressives have a tendency to mock fan behavior, which I think is a detrimental habit. Instead of mocking fan behavior, of regressive movements, I think we should pay attention to how it manifests and learn from it. So this picture is one of many, many pictures that were available of MAGA supporters at Trump rallies doing the Heil Hitler salute. I found this image compelling as an illustration of fan behavior on the opposite side of the tracks. Can keep a negative regressive movement going. And we need to find an effective strategy for progressive movements for restorative justice that has similar symbols and similar enthusiasm and similar sustainability to counteract this messaging. There's massive potential in leveraging this fan behavior for our causes. People want positive change. When you get them together in groups like this, you can see the difference in the two groups when you put them side by side. You can see the hope, you can see the positivity in the progressive movements, but you can also see that there's no cohesive symbolism in this group that's bringing them together as there are with the regressive groups. Progressive movements often target large, crunchy social problems, and this creates a separate challenge that can sometimes cause infighting among the smaller subgroups of the progressive movement's participants. Sorry, you hear my slide rustling, my paper rustling, because I want to make sure I'm giving you all the facts for each slide. This slide, we talk about some of the critiques of the Women's March that made it into the news. Some of these you will be familiar with. Both the organizers and the participants were attempting to ensure that the movement would last past a single day of action by encouraging the use of performative signaling, especially on sites like Instagram. An example of the breakdown in messaging can be seen in the difference between the post from the organization and the post from the participants, right? So the posts from the organization were more salesy in tone. Posts from the participants were looking for a message from the organization. There was no unification. Excuse me. Though the original organizers of the Women's March were a diverse group of women, the march still received criticism about inclusivity. For example, some people in the disability community criticized or organized a disability march separately and held it entirely online to help disabled people participate, and criticized the Women's March organizers for ableism and not thinking to include them in this way from the initial planning of the event. Trans women and non-binary folks have taken issue with the, quote, pussy hats that were ubiquitous at the march as excluding people without a uterus in the movement, as well as the appearance and inclusion of TERFs, transgender exclusionary radical feminists like this woman here with this offensive sign, and their anti-trans messaging at the march. Some of the original organizers also received criticism that they were anti-Semitic and have since stepped down, replaced by a new cohort of diverse leaders. The Women's March was also criticized for placing the organizers and celebrity participants on a literal stage instead of having them march alongside supporters, another thing that has since changed in the 2021 March. Another critique from the trans community relating to the ubiquitous pussy hats spoke about biological essentialism, as well as calling them out for representing a subjugated majority rather than oppressed minority. In the months leading up to the 2021 March, women had begun wearing Handmaid's Tale outfits at various unrelated protests and were planning to wear them en masse to the 2021 Women's March until women of color and Indigenous women noted that this costume appealed mostly to white women, that white women wearing them were cosplaying activism, not treating the movement seriously, and taking the microphone away from the people who deserve to have it. This is also a personal critique that I thought of when I was tackling this topic. I wondered if my voice would be useful. Participants also received such pushback on social media for our planned outfits, so much that the leaders of the Women's March asked them not to come if they were planning to wear the Handmaid's Tale outfits. For the last critique, oops, I went back a slide, pardon me. For the last critique for in-group infighting and purity testing, we touched on that in an earlier slide. Um, that really shows up with Democrats challenging each other's efforts instead of supporting each other's efforts, nitpicking about messaging. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. Shepard Fairey made a reappearance as part of the official symbolism of the Women's March. You may remember him from his work on the Obama campaign for his campaign posters. He was one of the symbols of the Women's March that has had some staying power. You still see these images being utilized today in related movements to the Women's March, overall causes, and the things that the march supports. These other images in the march were participant driven and participant design. There was very little official signage from the Women's March organizers in 2017. This iconic image is of a Muslim woman, a Native American woman, and a Latina woman. There was and a Black child, and they were displayed under the words "We the People" everywhere they were shown. I appreciated how both the 2017 March and the 2021 March made sure to include men, because radical, real feminism does include men as well. And meaning making through the signs and slogans for men was a defining, unifying, and messaging tactic of both the 2017 and 2021 Women's March. You may wonder why I'm calling out the 2017 and 2021 March when there were marches in between, and that is because the marches in between were disorganized, not well attended. I chose the two most significant marches to focus on. The messaging for men also had the additional backing of some star power from the UN, where they promoted the he for she hashtag. And this was very successful on social media in a way that the messaging for the Women's March itself was not. We cannot talk about the Women's March without talking about the ubiquitous pussy hats, the most iconic, resonant, and yet hotly debated symbol from the 2017 March. They were made by hand by or for each protester who wore one as an act of solidarity, and they became the defining symbol of the day. Easy to spot, simple to understand, unifying, and memorable. They also gave people who could not be present at the march a way to participate, and became a way for women to bond over creating these hats in the weeks prior to the march itself. These are all qualities one wants in a symbol for a movement that needs a fandom. After the march, however, the hats soon became the newest criticism of the Women's March from trans people and people without a uterus who felt that they were exclusive of their work. The newest criticism of the Women's March focuses on national versus local activism and sustaining activism and the goals of the organization. At its founding, the Women's March was intended to galvanize against an existential threat, and in the marches between, with no galvanizing event, they were less successful. This march in 2021 had the galvanizing event of the Texas Heartbeat Bill. We are all familiar with the resonant images of Princess Leia and Carrie Fisher from the Women's March. This also has become a symbol that has moved outside of the Women's March and has been now associated with feminist movements and feminism everywhere. So it is a symbol that's been divested from its original intent. This iconic space princess and quick-witted actress who played her were equally representative of the ideals of many of the movement's participants. The character was known for being a leader on screen, while the actress was known for hating Donald Trump and everything he stood for, which made for a perfect homegrown symbolic metaphor that women could carry on signs and wear on their t-shirts. Dozens of variations of Princess Leia could be found at every march, most often coupled with a phrase like, "A woman's place is in the resistance." All of this finally brings us to fan theory. One key to understanding the struggle progressive movements have traditionally had with fan building can be found in sports and the way fans both idolize and identify with their favorite teams. Regressive movements understand how to create symbols of solidarity and participation opportunities, as well as how to center the participant at the center of the story being told by the regressive movement's leaders. Another area where regressive movements succeed in fandom building is that of creating an experiential ecosystem. Regressive movements meet their fans' need for community. MAGA, for example, offers the regressives a shared, easily understandable umbrella goal and a rallying cry. They bolster their sense of self in relation to a larger group, and they provide organization, both organization of their beliefs and of the actual organization of the Republican Party. By effectively using fan theory and social identity theory to create solidarity and to isolate people with opposing viewpoints as an other, regressive movements have proven to have a long shelf life. Progressive movements looking to build fandoms in support of restorative justice can look to these successes in the opposing group and leverage that competition to improve their movement. Another opportunity for progressives lies in understanding and leveraging competition within their own group. In other words, finding ways to turn that in-group infighting about pussy hats, turfs, and other friction-causing challenges to their advantage by using them as a lever for intergroup discourse and solidarity building. By doing this, progressive movements can coalesce around collective action through collective identity, rather than stagnating at the first sign of imperfection. Taking a brief water break. This brings us to social identity theory. So by building opportunities for a collective identity as a cornerstone for how social identity theory can be used to sustain and grow grassroots restorative justice movements like the Women's March, one concept that can move progressives from sporadic attempts to successful movement building is that of enduring empowerment. Specifically, the idea of collective self-objectification is useful as it gives participants in a movement a way to see the impact their role has on collective action and the impact it has on the movement as a whole. This in turn builds emotional resonance with the cause, providing a positive overall feeling for the experience of participating in collective action, moving the participants from a state of despair, negative emotions like despair, which are often cited by participants as the impetus for joining a progressive movement, to a state of joy, accomplishment, and empowerment. Another necessary aspect of movement building lies in the idea of self-categorization theory, wherein the idea of us versus them is formed as part of a participant cementing their place within a group during conflict with an outgroup. Riker and Drury point out that historically crowds are formed by those without institutional power, and this is certainly true of progressive movements, which tend to represent the need for social change to benefit the marginalized. Importantly, regressive movement participants, while usually in a privileged or otherwise protected class, self-identify as not having power or as being marginalized. It's vital that progressive movement organizers understand that dynamic on the other team, so to speak, as they are shaping their narratives. This brings into play another aspect of crowd psychology and fandom building, that of both participants and spectators as being social actors. Sports psychology is important in movement building. The same emotional resonance a fan feels with a favorite sports team is being activated every time they support their cause. And certainly, a cause is more societally important than a football game, but our brains are hardwired to see these inputs as similar stimuli. This means that the emotional feedback participants receive from the group during a conflict both solidifies their adherence to the group and its norms and spurs them into taking action to affect real societal change. It's imperative that progressive movements study fan theory and social identity theory as a means to grow participation in their causes. What can psychology tell us about this? Stark's expansion of Weber's idea of elective affinity puts emphasis on the concept that ideas and the carriers of ideas require what he described as mutual accommodation. Effectively, that ideas are always looking for groups to carry them, and groups are always seeking out ideas to carry. Neuromarketing supports this general concept. Studies tell us that people respond to the stimuli they receive from a strong emotional story, and that they carry that response with them ongoing. Regressive movements like MAGA are excellent at conveying simplistic, regressive ideas within strong emotional stories, usually stories based in fear or anger, fear being an especially strong emotion for driving behavior. Regressive movements use storytelling that centers the listener, a powerful way to turn a simple supporter into a true fan. Progressive movement leaders looking to build successful restorative justice movements can learn from the regressive and include more emotional storytelling to convey their message to a wider audience. Restorative justice movements can also leverage the way people belonging to progressive movements see themselves by incorporating social identity theory to move the needle on their fandom building efforts. Inclusivity via micro stories with the macro story might be one way to strengthen the effectiveness of restorative justice causes as well. Creating emotionally resonant stories for participants can help enhance the necessary us versus them mentality that spurs participants in a restorative justice movement into taking action on behalf of the group. While creating these larger narratives, progressive movement organizers also must become adept at creating the stories for smaller, disparate groups within the larger group, while also ensuring that these smaller stories are interlocking with and supporting the overarching narrative of the movement. A future well-organized women's march, for example, could have a collective at the top, comprised of people that represent all marginalized groups, including the disabled, trans, LGBTQ communities, as well as the Black, Indigenous, and Latinx community and others. Because white people and able-bodied people have the greatest majority representation in society as a whole, priority would be given to the needs and goals of the other marginalized groups during planning. The biggest challenge would be to turn infighting about things like unifying symbols, such as the pussy hats, from a destructive force that eliminates any chance of a unifying symbols creation to a creative force that allows participants to be social actors within this group and improve the symbols together. Sustainability is another necessary step in movement building. Additionally, organizers that leverage the idea of building opportunities for enduring empowerment for their participants will see increased loyalty for future work within the movement. A recurring challenge faced by progressive movements, especially when they include white voices who are not used to having to sustain activity for social change in the same way that more marginalized groups have had to, is creating the emotional attachment to the group and to the success of the group's mission that keeps participants active longer than a single day once a year. Marches like the Women's March are excellent awareness builders, but the real work for restorative justice happens between the ostentatious parades and requires coloring outside the lines of society, not just carrying protest signs. This need for sustainability is where digital media, social media, and media psychology can play a role in movement building. Certainly, posting Instagram stories the day of the protest and in the immediately surrounding weeks is useful, but not necessarily sticky enough to last and to grow. Excellent social tools for movement building include short video on sites with finely tuned algorithms that don't require ads for leverage, like social short video streaming platform TikTok, as well as portable, flexible community building out of the public eye on distributed, controlled, private social platforms, such as peer-hosted communities like Discord. Actionable goals is the last necessity in this long list. Recently, a popular attempt to hold a national labor strike on October 15th failed. This was in part because the organizers of the strike refused to set a list of goals and demands or to address the potential need for the protest to last for more than a day. The Women's March has faced similar hurdles in the past, largely centered on not including marginalized groups in their goal setting for the organization, although they have begun to address this in 2021 after receiving significant public pushback about this issue. Having actionable goals gives your participants a measurable way to see how they are contributing, which in turn reinforces their sense of belonging to the group and self-categorization. There's a need for progressive organizers not to turn a blind eye to what fan theory, sports, and social identity theory can do for their work. There might be a tendency to see utilizing fan psychology as trivializing a push for serious societal change, creating friction and resistance to embracing these techniques. However, a better way to frame it could be that they would simply be using the quirks of the human brain to the advantage of their restorative justice movements and to the advantage of society. And I just want to take a minute to thank Tunisha specifically, since she's here. You've been a mentor for several classes now, and I appreciate it very much. So thank you for all of your input and helping me expand my ideas about this topic, but many other topics as well. And if you are here watching the slide deck, anybody here who's here, I'm happy to send this ridiculous reference slide to you if you're curious where I got some of this information. And I'm going to turn my camera back on and stop sharing my screen.
That was wonderful.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I was nervous.
It was really good. And I'm one of those weirdos that would want the slide deck because I think it was fabulous.
I'm happy to send the slide deck around. The more people talking about this, the better, in my opinion. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have some of the same interests that you do. So I really, no, I really appreciated it. You know, I often struggled with when I was writing my paper on this, you know, when I look at the regressive movement, the, you know, the MAGAs, is that what you call it? You know, Trump people.
yeah.
Versus the Women's March, I often feel like the Women's March did have a lot of different groups that was trying to appease, right? Where the regressive movement, it definitely was fueled by fear, which is a real huge emotion that moves people, but they weren't as diverse, right? So I kind of wonder if that sort of plays into the, you know, how can we be all things to all people, but then we have this one organization that's like, you know, I hate to say it, but has racist ideas and
Yeah.
do you know what I'm saying? So it's like,
I noticed that like when I was
yeah.
planning this, and the one thing I couldn't figure out how to quantify, so I just ended up leaving it out of my paper because I couldn't quantify it academically. I could talk about it all day long, but
Right, sure.
There's this ability that specifically Republicans in regressive movements have to set aside their individual goals for a unifying message. They don't care what the message is. They don't care if it will serve them. They're very, very able to set aside all of their nitpicking for one message to carry their movement forward. And progressives are not good at doing that. We want everybody to be heard. And so I think probably the next thing I want to tackle in research is figuring out that, how to solve that difference. That's very specific, but I felt like it took the paper a little away from the Women's March to spend too much time on it. So
right. Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I was going to ask you too, like, where would you like to take this kind of next, right? Like what aspect to looking into it? Because there's, I mean, obviously, like I've read your paper, still reading it, and there's so many different things. And even I'm like taking new notes as you're going through your slide, because I just keep, it's one of those things that like when you revisit, something else comes up, right? Like, oh, like what about this, or a new point, which is why, you know, we know it's so hard to like take something so huge, getting it into something tangible to have a conversation about. And I think one of the things lending off of what you're just talking about with diversity is that like it reminds me of like overall just management, right? And figuring out like management is managing the short term while still making plans for the long term. And making sure that the things that you're doing in the short term, those are seeds, so the long-term shit can grow, right?
Yeah.
So it has to be that dual-minded, like this is a priority, like this is due first, so I'm going to do this, but make sure that it helps inform and helps create a foundation for the long-term things. So making sure that like those values are aligned with your actions, right? Like there has to be some foundation. And that's what I think you were getting into when talking about like fandom, is that like you have to have the participants remaining active. And that's where sustainability comes from. But I was wondering, like, because I know you talked about active publics, and that was a phrase that like I honestly hadn't really heard of. And the fact that you had looped it into like fandom was great. And I'm wondering, like, do you think that's like maybe an evolution of fandom in terms of like you have those levels of affiliation, right? Like, because I know and you know, like when talking about like sports fandom and stuff, you have someone who's a Lakers fan only because they grew up in LA or because their boyfriend is and they watch, so just to try to be a part of things. And then you have those that are like ride or die, season ticket, all the colors, right? And they have all those things. So you have those levels. And so active publics, now can that be like an extra extension where now it's like, now I'm in the streets, now I'm actually trying to recruit folks, now I'm where it's, you know, where you're getting your participant, the member of that community is being a bit more engaged in for almost like that external stakeholdership, where now it's like, it's not so external anymore. It's all all you
It's-
are, right?
So it's a concept that I use in PR, right? And the source I cited for purposes of this research is Kirk Halloran, who has written several good books about it if you're interested in reading it. And he actually focuses more on the inactive public for PR because you're trying to activate the inactive public. But I saw a more useful tie-in to taking the idea past a fandom, right? So if you want to build a sustainable movement, you have to get people to be fans of your movement, but then you also have to get the movement to become part of their daily lives. So they're continually activating on these ideas and continually working for the cause. And that's especially important for progressive movements because our causes are more difficult. They're just more difficult and they require more internal work. So that was I speak about this a bit more deeply in my paper, but the fact that it is physically and emotionally difficult to fight for progressive ideals and requires so much personal change. I never stopped learning since I became aware of how much I didn't know about restorative justice and everything. Like I feel like I will never stop learning and I never stop changing. And for people that are not inclined to embrace that much change in their life, it can be really difficult, really challenging, and it can push them away from the movement. So that's why I think moving to an active public mentality, if we can figure out how to get there, is one way to actually make some of these changes stick.
Sure. Because I think too, one of the things like with fandom, it's at least like kind of sports fandom or even just more of the lifestyle oriented stuff like Peloton or yoga or Jeep people, just those other types where there needs to be that prompt, right? Some invitation.
Yeah.
There has to be that invitation. Like, who's that person that's going to take you to your first game, give you your first ride in a Jeep, take you on a hike from, you know what I mean? Like that type of invitation. And if we're thinking about like societal values or like intellectual fan, right? If we're in alignment around a certain belief or a certain, like a value or belief. The thing that that the harsh reality is that like, we're all not going to think the same. We're all not going to, we're all not going to believe in certain things. And how do we control what we can control, right? Because I always kind of say jokingly and stuff on Twitter, it's like, oh, well, hey, check out my podcast, or don't, because not everybody's meant to be dope. Not everyone is supposed to be, not all going to be the same, right?
Yeah.
And so knowing that there is going to be regressive movements and those that think so deeply opposed to like what we believe in terms of just like human rights and equity and racism and all of these types of things, how can we just concentrate on making sure that our sandbox is fine so that nobody else can pollute it? Like, I'm always so much more interested in making sure my sandbox is fine and the people in here are all vibing, because that other sandbox, they can do whatever they want. We're all going to, right? So it's like, how do we kind of think about this in terms of not having to wait for someone to be our, hey, show up at this time, but empower each individual to feel like they can contribute actively in their own, right? Like in our own spaces.
Yeah. It's interesting because I want to do a lot to build the movement, but it's a lot of different things. So it's almost like each thing is its own giant project. But one of the places I want to get to help people get to is a place where the laziest person can feel like a participant, right? Yeah. Because the reality of this is that trying to think of a polite way to say this, white people like myself are often the problem, because we are part of the problem, even when we intend to do good, because we truly are not used to sustained struggle.
Yeah.
Right.
Just not. Even the least privileged white person is truly not used to the same sustained struggle as every other marginalized group out there. And I see it happening over and over, and I don't know how to fix it yet, but I see people like, they get tired, they get frustrated, they get cranky, they start throwing a wrench in the works, or they get offended, right? You know, a white person will get offended and then the discussion stops because you have to stop and coddle our white people feelings. So that's a big problem outside of the Women's March that we're talking about
you're
now.
right.
But I think it's one that we have to solve if we want to be successful in this. Right?
That's very true, because it reminds me
Yeah.
of like, if we all say out loud like what we believe in, and if we truly do that, that if we truly believe in what we say we do, then you almost have to like have that hierarchy, right? Of like what's most important.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then that should inform and influence then like how we behave. And it's like, we talked about it before, but like the work I do at Black Girl Hockey Club. And like when we made this anti-racism campaign, we called it Get Uncomfortable because it was intended for our allies.
Yeah.
It was intended for our allies, like the non-Black folk that are, you know, in our hockey communities and stuff, to get uncomfortable and help us now, right? Help us have these conversations, like, because we can't assume that like, okay, if we're talking about like racism and all of these things, you can't expect Black people to suffer from and create the solution for the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So true. But you know what? I think that was one important thing to look at with the Women's March, because I think it got people together, right? I mean, that was part of the success, that it, you know, we can look at all the issues that did come from it and all the intergroup conflict, because there was a lot. And as we said, we can't satisfy everyone. That's pretty difficult. But the fact that these people actually gathered, I think it could cause conversations, you know, it could cause those conversations, at least, you know, get uncomfortable, at least think about it. And I often think that some people, I think, you know, after that event, maybe their minds were changed a bit.
Yeah.
You know, and I know in my paper, I kept thinking about broaden and build theory, even if that experience was so fabulous and that feeling of coming together was so moving, because it was, you know, what can that do with our cognitive selves? Because that opens up our thinking and it helps us to hear the other side. So how can we even embrace that more, right? So I don't know. There was so many, I agree with you. There were so many issues that it's like, how do we solve all this? But at the same time, I think we have to just keep drilling down. So part of what you did was like, you know, do that. So.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what you write about, because now I feel like we should have a separate topic.
Send her your paper.
And like,
Send her your paper. Your
I will,
infographic, Janine, too, was great.
Yeah.
But Danny, I know you had a question. What are you gonna say?
Well, question, comment. Also, Janine, if you like broaden and build, I was just doing a slide on that right before I got on here, part of my presentation. So interesting. Also, great presentation. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for letting us be a part of it. Interesting, you had a whole segment on Carrie Fisher, because look what's over my shoulder.
That's right.
This is a Star Wars shrine, though, and you only see the tip of the iceberg. Like, you don't even know what's on these walls.
Same. Star Wars and Wonder Woman here. That is
so.
what dominates.
I had one question. I have two, but we'll see what I get to. I have one though, since you know, you're focused on symbols, and you know, you did speak to the social media outlets. You know, it's tricky, I think, because social media obviously can create a opportunity for connectedness, but it also can create a shoot ton of noise. And I was just wondering, like, do you believe that strong symbols, you know, can rise above that, can actually help spread messages of activism in a digital setting?
Yes, depending on the digital setting. So what I find, I'd say this is a two-part answer. So first of all, what I find with social media specifically is that the usefulness of every platform, every individual platform, diminishes over time at the same rate across platforms, right? So you can predict when a platform will no longer be useful. So TikTok and Discord are at the peak of usefulness right now. Twitter is in mid-decline, is where I would put Twitter. Facebook is on its way out. Metaverse is not going to save it all. The metaverse is going to introduce new social networks and new problems that we'll have to solve as a society. Facebook itself is out. Instagram might save itself with stories copying from TikTok, but also on the decline. So if you pick the right spot to put your symbol and your message at the right time, then social media is perfect for symbolism. So I will use TikTok as an example. The October 15th strike that I was talking about earlier, that movement started from an offhand TikTok comment that one of the little Gen Z kids, and I say little Gen Z kids, I don't mean to insult you, Gen Z, I love you, put out as an idea, and people ran with it, but it didn't really have a strong organizing body. No one would really own the event. It didn't have a good message, but the trajectory from idea to movement with a web page and millions of people talking about it was a week. It had strong symbolism. It had the resonant messaging. Something like that is ideal for a movement like this. They didn't have the organizer to back it up, unfortunately. Discord is another great place, which seems counterintuitive because it's private, right? It's peer-to-peer. But if you get invited to the right Discord, it's like Reddit used to be in the old days. The idea takes off like wildfire on the back channel, which is just invaluable for progressive movements, because a lot of progressive activism can be dangerous. That's another challenge with it. It can truly be dangerous. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
honestly, I kind of wanted to ask it in a pretty open way. So yeah, that does. If you have time for one more comment, nobody should be able to answer if you can. Extra points. This isn't really necessarily based on what you did, but one thing, I think I'm just thinking out loud here, like, I would never advocate spreading conspiracy theories or propaganda, but like we can't ignore like that they're frustratingly successful. Like why are people sticking to anti-vaxxing, to voter fraud? I guess overall, and I should apply to myself and whatever I do in the future, like what void is that filling for people? And like how could we take a positive element of that, like figure out what that void is and in a more positive way fill that, whether it is like symbolism and activism like you're doing. I'm doing video games and empathy, so nice. I'll have to think a little harder on that, but that's a comment. I don't think that that's fair to like, here's this hot potato, I'm going to sign out.
I have thoughts on it. On it. So early on in the pandemic, I did not have a TikTok, and I wish I did. Because I was wanting to spread conspiracy theories about anti-conspiracy theories, right? So there is a certain type of person with a certain type of brain, bigger amygdala, more fear-based, more open to authoritarian thinking, more uncertain about the world, that is particularly prone to conspiracy theory. And you can change their mind to progressive causes with conspiracy theory messaging, is my belief. And some people are proving it out now, right? And here's where the progressives are about to get in their own way. Progressive person decided to start a counter-conspiracy theory that if you had to get vaccinated to keep your job, if you took a bath in, I think they said Epsom salts and eucalyptus, I forget, they made it like some concoction, that it would magically erase the effects of the shot for the vaccine. And it caught on. And people are doing it. Sadly, now I see progressives, ever the nitpickers, going, that's a conspiracy theory. Ha ha ha. I can't believe people fell for this. And I'm like, oh, like, no, let them. This one was on purpose. Let them fall for it. But no, it would work. You're on the right track. I don't know how ethical it is to fight conspiracy with conspiracy, but yeah, totally works.
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily want to fight fire with fire. I would just want to understand what is the fire warming? I guess I would start there, but great answer and very insightful. And thank you. I just learned a lot in just what you said.
I'm trying to remember. Do you know who it is, Leslie, that she made an amazing like infographic about conspiracy theories?
Yes, Abby Richards.
Is that it? I'm trying to find her tweet that had that. And I was like, why is this the most brilliant? What is it?
She's at Abby R on Twitter, and she's at Tophology, TOFOLOGY on TikTok. And she actually made that a poster you can buy now because people liked it so much. So you can actually buy the inverted conspiracy theory pyramid as a poster.
Thank you. I'm going to put this in the chat so you guys could see what we're talking about. Because I remember I saw a couple of her like TikTok videos like talking about this, like explaining this infograph where it's like the bottom is where you're grounded in reality. It's like the speculation, like the stuff that really happened, like COINTELPRO shit, right? And then like all the way up into like horse tranquilizer, like cute, like anything. So like this detached from reality version, it's just an amazing, let me copy it and just paste it and stop talking.
Yeah, she's great. I love her. Her TikToks explaining it are the best.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and find one of the videos where I did it so that you folks can see it too. But I want to be cognizant of time and stuff. I know it's late for the East Coast and Midwest folks, but is there any like last minute questions or comments? Janine, do you have a last one? Or Carol, I know you're gonna maybe hop off in a sec too. You're at work and it's late, but is there any other questions or comments?
No, I thought this was great. And
Oh, I'm
Leslie,
glad
we
you
should
enjoyed it.
talk offline about just this and
Definitely.
start our own movement, start our own conspiracy theories, whatever. No.
Definitely. I'm at Leslie on Twitter too. If you guys,
Okay.
I'm always wanting to talk about this stuff on Twitter as well. Everyone always wants me to talk about marketing on Twitter, but I like this better.
Stuff. I can't find this video, but I will try and find it and I can distribute it later. But you can find her account there and find the rest of her stuff on social, because Abby's stuff is very much related into what you folks were just talking about in regards to like conspiracy, fighting conspiracy with conspiracy. Like that's literally, it's just like corrupt chess. That's like what we're doing at some point. It's like what we feel like we have to, unfortunately. But I think that's what's so great about the opportunity for innovation, that I think we all are really starting to work in and do this stuff. You know, it's the application of theory and using that to really just try and identify those gaps like we've been talking about. And that's how we are able to take what we're learning here to the next step and to the next place, and making it very pragmatic and sustainable and for good, God forbid, right?
Yeah. Definitely. I'm glad you guys came and enjoyed the presentation.
Oh yeah, it was great. Thank you so much for allowing us, and sorry about putting my fingers on my phone all the time. I'm like, whoever watches this later is gonna be like, what's with that woman? What is happening? So I apologize, but it was awesome. Thank you, Leslie.
Awesome. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, Leslie, you did a fantastic job. Your paper's amazing. It's obviously going to be available for everyone to be able to download, you know, in our Fielding library and stuff. And this recording will be available as well. And so please always reach out. You know, obviously, if she wants to share this deck, which was beautiful and very, very well done and informative, you feel free to do so. And yeah, so we can just wrap this up. And I'd just like to say, welcome to the community of scholars. Congratulations, Leslie.
Thank you.
And you're not done, because now you're in the PhD program.
I am.
Oh my God, congratulations.
She's going to start the doctoral program in the spring. So you get a little break.
Yes, a little break. And then it's back to dismantling corrupt systems.
Yes, new program. Amazing. Well, congratulations again, Leslie. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.